Hi everyone. I hope you all can hear me and can see me as well. My name is Andrews. I genuinely forgot to put an introduction slide on the PowerPoint. So sorry about that, but my name is Andrews. I've been debating since 2018. I'm currently a full-time debate coach in Hong Kong. I've been doing that for over 2 years now. Um, So that's literally what I'm about to do here is practically me doing another one of everyday work that I do for the past roughly 2.5 years. But in terms of doing debate coaching from coaching universities, when I was in school, president of my debate club, I'm a member of KDS, the KNUST Debate Society from Ghana. I've been to Worlds twice, I think. I was in the ESL semi-final of Belgrade Worlds, the only time I attended Worlds and book. But yeah, I've done quite a number of competitions and debate is fun. I think there are a lot of things to learn around debate. And as of now, once in a while, I return to maybe do a spar round or speak at a competition. I think last weekend I was at a competition. So hopefully this session helps and improves all of our understanding around the things that we know around debate. So the session will be a lot more conversational. I don't like lecturing, which is not a great way of teaching. So what I'm going to do is there will be a lot of back and forth questions. Please participate as much as you can so that it's not a one-sided lesson. But also, if you have questions, feel free to either use the raise hand feature like this, like I've just done, or you could also indicate in the chat. Occasionally, I'll check there in case you have any questions, and feel free to do that so that we can make sure that we all have the same understanding as we progress throughout the sessions. Just give me a sec and we can start. Okay. So today I want us to talk about exploiting burdens in debate. While preparing the PowerPoints for this session, I just remembered that the first time I actively thought about this to a group of debaters was in 2020 during the COVID period, where we had a little WhatsApp group called For the Love of the Sport. And because we were all out of school, I used to organize sessions to train, I think, first years in the Ghanaian Debate Society about debate. And it was the very first time I sat down to really think about burdens and sort of draw them out and explain how to teach them. I think preparing this slide made me realize how far or how much more refined I've gone, those same thoughts I've gone through in my ability to teach it today with much more clarity than probably I did the very first time I attempted to do that. So we would walk through these because I believe at the heart of every debate is burdens. And for me, understanding them helps you with strategy. I'm a big fan of strategy because I think it's the lazy way to win debates, which means knowing exactly what to do and how to do it so you don't have to do everything. But I think at the heart of strategy is also burdens and your ability to understand them for yourselves. What helps you build the most resilient case, probably never run out of rebuttal. I have one question and get into whatever I want to teach, which is parents are good at bringing up children. Let's say that there was a debate topic and it's a claim generally that someone made in the debate. I want us to try and think, what does the person need to prove? What are the burdens for this claim? It seems like a very one-line claim, but there are a lot of things people need to prove for this claim to be true. So any ideas are welcome. Like I said, this is going to be a lot of chit chatting than once this claim that parents are good at bringing up children. Anyone, any volunteers to contribute to this? Mm. Any ideas from anyone? Okay, let's see. In the chat says parents by themselves might not be the best at bringing up children. Okay, proven, but this is okay. So why do you think parents by themselves are not or might not be the best at bringing up children? If we explore that, we can figure out the burdens they need to cope. Favor, or is it a contribution? I'm not sure which it is, which is which. If you have any ideas, drop them in the chat so we can, because if we're able to experience life, okay, that's good, experience life, which means you would probably parents provide the primary source of love, probably care about the children. So contributions. Any other contributions? Any other contributions? Any other contributions? And I use this example because as was the one example that I thought I had proven enough burdens and still realized I hadn't. And so I didn't win that claim. I couldn't persuade the judge of that claim. And so it's probably the simplest, but also the best claim to try and unpack the conception of burdens and the idea of what burdens are. So we have parents have experience in life, which is good. We have a second one which says they have a primary source of, which is good. So two claims. Any other things we can think of? Any other things you can think of as to things that we can say to persuade a judge that parents are indeed good at bringing up children? Okay, incentive to care about the child. Good. So I think the incentive to care uh, the source of love, the affect. So that's a set of incentives. Again, good way of framing it as well. Any other suggestions before we move on? Biologically motivated through evolution, so that is good. Parents have a biological motivation to carry this out. They love their children, so they try to be good at it. Great. Another motivation or incentive, essentially. So if you notice, a lot of you are suggesting things around incentives. So for instance, let's look out of the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, out of the 6 ideas that we've gotten in the chat, all of them are around incentives. If you look at parents have experienced life, that one boils around capacity. So parents, or maybe information, parents just know a lot more about life, so they could potentially be much more capable of taking care or bringing up their children. But if you look at all the other suggestions, parents provide primary source of love, affection, they care about them, so they would be good at bringing them up. The second one is incentive to care about the children, same incentive that drives them. They love their children, same thing about the internal drive and incentive. They care about the children, same thing. So you the chance out of 6, 5 of them are around incentive. Now that's not surprising because a lot of the time incentive is the way in which people trust burdens exist. They're just, I think, the easiest forms of burdens that you can come up with. But let's think about it. For instance, let's use this claim. Parents are good at bringing up children. We need to be able to prove that, like all of you have said, they have the incentive to carry this out, to bring up children in a good way. So that's one. I think there are so many different layers of proof there. I can add a bit more beyond all the internal incentives that you guys have said. There are also external incentives. Like, for instance, the state has laws that they expect parents to meet a certain threshold of duty of care. If you do not meet it in certain take the child away from you, all sorts of things. So there's also external motivation or incentive that compels parents to bring up their children in a good way, right? So those are incentives. There's a capacity to execute those incentives. It's qualified to bring up children. And I'm sure a parent would do something that is not great, but then their justification is, which means that there are several incentives, but poor capacity, or they go about the execution of that incentive very, very poorly. So you also need to prove that parents have good capacity in order to execute whatever you want them to execute, right? So parents have, as we've come to understand, and there are several other mechanisms around this. Beyond incentives and capacity, we also need to prove, do parents know exactly how? So what is the process? And I think the idea that parents have experienced life sort of feeds into that idea. So I can say parents are great, they love their kids, they have know how mechanism of bringing up children. They might have good incentives, they might have good capacity, but without a good process or a good knowledge of the process, they are going to lose, right? So they would still not be able to guarantee you that. Then you also have to question, are there any limitations to the ability of parents who has the money and the capacity, but they are stuck at work because they are single parent? So they have limitations to their ability. If you do not prove that the parent does not have limitations, or that the limitations are not significant enough to, again, you are missing out on a burden, right? And then finally, you can guarantee the outcomes that you want. So just in this simple claim, we fleshed out incentives, capacity, process or mechanism, limitations, and then these four things can eventually guarantee your outcome. So if I want to rebut someone who is making this claim, they might have thought that they've proven all the things, but maybe they didn't talk about limitations. I'll just walk in and say, yeah, I agree with all that you said. Its ability to execute their intentions about their children, like they are stuck at work several hours. Children spend more time in school than they would ever spend with their parents at home. Parents, even at home, are busy. They are trying to catch up with work that is outstanding before they get back into the office the next day. Parents have a lot of things. They are stressed. They are tired. They don't pay attention that much. So if I'm just able to explain one of these burdens that you didn't fulfill in your chain of logic, you are likely to lose the argument. This is how powerful burdens can be if you understand them. Prove them well, you have an airtight argument, but also it means that if your opponents fail to prove them, you can always see them very, very easily and call them out. And you always have a rebuttal, no matter how much they try to prove it. The difficult thing is also, like I said, nobody would spend time proving all these five burdens to just prove one statement. At least most debaters won't, which means you can skipping a particular group, right? So just as a surface overview, this is the kind of thing we're going to be looking at as to the kinds of burdens you need to prove. Like we've seen here, if we don't prove incentive or capacity or process or limitations, we are not guaranteed any of the outcomes of good parenthood. Therefore, we can claim this all we want, but then it's still a weak argument just because we didn't prove these basic things. So I hope this overview makes sense, and then we can proceed on the specific. Very simple to understand, but it's also the perfect example of simple claims or simple impacts or outcomes that still require a very structured and layered approach to executing the burdens that are involved in there. So I hope this makes sense. And if there are any questions, I'll take them now before we proceed. Any questions? Any questions? Okay. No questions as of now. Or are there any questions in the chat? No, not yet. All right. So I think at this point, we probably have a fair idea of what a burden is. But essentially, burdens are what you must prove to stand, for an argument to stand, right? And like we've said, almost every argument have a very, very complex and structured layers of burdens. If you don't prove them well, and your opponents are aware of that, your argument would collapse because they would always call you out for it. But if you prove them well, then it means that you have a very, very strong argument. So you can make it a point to just be so good at burdens that that's how you win debates. You just win debates by pointing out that people didn't fulfill their burdens within their arguments, therefore their outcomes are not assured, and just focus on fulfilling your burdens and proving them very, very well. I've essentially spent time taking down people's arguments without rebutting them, but by just exploiting the fact that they had a burden to prove and they didn't prove it. And I usually tend to do that when the argument is very good. And I know that, yeah, this sounds very persuasive, and I don't want to rebut the outcome, but I just want to weaken the entire chain of logic by just exploiting a burden that they failed to fulfill. So that being said, let's look at the two uses of burdens. You use burdens to build your case, and you can also use burdens to break opponents' argument. In terms of using burdens to build your case, you sort of have to prove the things that must be true for your argument to be believable or to be assured. You need to prove why those things are true. You need to prove how those things work, and you need to prove why those things matter in order for the arguments to be true. We would look at the specific set of burdens that generally apply to most debates. There are a few that come up once in a while, but I still think all of them tend to fall into this 7 set of burdens that apply to a lot of debates. On the opposition's end, you're able to use this to break their arguments, because then you need to just be able to understand what they needed to prove, but they failed to do, where their argument depends on a specific burden, but they just blindly assumed it, and where their mechanisms collapsed. So for instance, if I had a prop argument that made the argument we started with, that parents are great at bringing up children, and their entire proof, even though we had like 5 layers of proof, or 5, basically if you merge them, there are about 3 key reasons why parents have great incentives, right? And therefore they are going to be good parents and bring up their children in a good way. It sounds persuasive if a speaker does that, but if I understand burdens, I'll be able to know it just fulfilled 1 out of about 5 burdens that they needed to fulfill. So I can just spend time exploring all the burdens that we failed to fulfill and show why that argument, as beautiful as it sounded, should not even go anywhere near the judge's considerations, because those are able to weaponize this for the specific set of opponent arguments that you want. What we're going to do now is to look at the types of burdens that we have. I think we've explored some of them, but then I would use it to explore, which is an exercise that we'll do together, a debate that my students did yesterday, which I think is a very interesting way of looking at burdens in very, very real scenario debates, and not just like very easy statements like the one we started with, right? Okay, so these are the 7 layers of burdens that essentially people tend to need for arguments to be true. You need a setup, you need incentives, capacity, process, or mechanism, possibility, limitations, and outcome. Patients are essentially two sides of the same coin, right? So if you are proving, you can either prove that it is possible, patients are minimal, please. Okay. And if you can understand these four things, they don't all apply. Let me put it this way, they all apply to every single outcome you want to prove, but they are not all controversial. So we would look at how do you determine which ones are the most important to prove? Because in my experience, that is probably the biggest headache. It's not that people do not know the burdens that exist, or even when you teach them the template set of burdens they should be considering all the time. The difficulty is you can't prove all seven in a debate, right? So for instance, in the statement that we were considering about parents loving or parents bringing up their children in a good way, we all sort of have a blind assumption that parents care and love. Would be wise to spend a lot of time proving the incentive, right? Because that's a very generally accepted norm that parents have the incentive to execute it. Where you might want to spend a bit more time proving is parents' capacity. Are parents really, really good at being parents? Because there are lots of parents who do not have the resources, they do not have the time, they do not have the revenue. So you would want to spend a little bit more time on proving capacity and less time on proving incentive. How to parent, they would maybe believe less that parent time on process or mechanism, but I might spend more time on limitations because everybody has sort of come to accept the idea that parents are too busy to take care of their children. So that would need a bit more explanation, which means I might run through 1, 2, 3, 4 mechanisms or burdens. But what you'd see me do when I'm on this, spend more time on this, spend less time on this, spend more time on this. And so that's really the tricky part about determining which parts or which burdens are probably the most important ones that you need to spend more time on and ensure that you prove them much more comprehensively. To scale through a lot of debates very comfortably. I think one of the things that people ignore about how burdens work is also it's a big determinant of speaker scores. So when I decided I wanted to get better at speaker scores, one of the things that I noticed as consistent feedback from judges was, well, even though you won the debate, your speech was not as comprehensive and it didn't cover all the burdens and it had loopholes. And you'd notice that, I'm sure we all know, in debates, you can be first and still have very average speaker scores because just that your opponents were weaker. So what you'd want to do is identifying these burdens, which ones are more important, and strategically spending more time on them means that you have a better chance of getting higher speaker scores and climbing up the speaker ladder because it makes you more comprehensive, more difficult to respond to or rebut. And that means you are strategically applying your time to the most controversial or the least believable issues within your burden set, right? So we would look at all these seven. I mean, we would basically run through them and then we can do a practical example. Wait, Aditya says my voice is breaking a bit. Oh, this was at a few minutes ago. Can you hear me, guys? Sorry. Oh, okay, fine now. Sorry about that. Did you guys miss anything when I was talking? And if my voice is breaking, you can just, I don't know, put your hands up or unmute and let me know. Um, and then I can pause or check it. I hope there was nothing significant missed in the process.
No, no, it was just a bit unclear during the first one slide. That's it.
Oh, okay, okay. Sorry about that. Um, Okay, so let's now move on to sort of try and explain each of these sets of burdens and look at what you need to do if you want to explore these. Um, I mean, we've already talked about how to identify the most controversial burden, but basically, if you want a systemic approach to it, then a way to do what I did when I was trying to explore which of the burdens is more important is to think about which parts of your argument require the most explanation, or which assumption will the judge least likely accept without you proving a lot. I'm sure a lot of judges would accept the notion that parents love their kids, but a lot of judges would not easily accept the notion that all parents or most parents have the resources, the time, and the capacity to be good parents, right? So then you'd probably want to spend a little bit more time on that. And you'd also then need to ask yourself, where is the biggest potential for disagreement or uncertainty? Because again, think about it. Less opposition teams would walk up and say, we are going to prove why parents don't love their children. I don't think op teams would do that. But op teams might get up and say parents do not have the capacity to be good parents because of these specific things about them. Maybe they don't have money, they don't have the resources, they don't have the time, and so by trying to identify the most controversial burdens, you are not just figuring out which burdens needs more effort to persuade the judge, you are essentially also building a fortification because those are the likely areas that an op team will challenge you on the debate if they want to question the logic of that argument. So prioritizing the proof of controversial burdens is probably the biggest thing you can learn to do when it comes to the understanding and applications of burdens. Okay. All right. Um, any questions here before we move on to the various types of or the various options of burdens that we have? Any questions? I was told that if you are teaching and people don't ask questions, it is one of two things. Either you're a very good teacher who is making a lot of sense and so people don't have to take questions, or you are so bad a teacher that people don't want to get more confused. So I just hope I'm a very good teacher and that's why nobody's asking questions. Okay, so let's let's get on with it and let's look at the very first. Wait, oh, I'm just realizing that. Uh, okay, this is good. So the first one is setup, right? Now, for setup, we essentially need to look at the description of the world within which the debate is happening in. Okay. And it's very important because a lot of the time people ignore it. Like the competition I did last weekend, the place I kept on getting people a lot was their setup. Everybody sort of assumed some shared understanding of how the world works, and therefore everybody started arguing in vacuum. And even when people try to do setup, they just do a shabby work at setup and ignore it, right? They do not specifically explain the different components, how they interact, and especially the components that affect the debate that they're about to do. And don't worry, when we do examples of it, like with the motion my student did yesterday, and I want to use that as a practical step by step. When we do that, you get a very specific scenario in which setup could have solved a lot of things, but people just didn't do it. So what you must prove when it comes to setup is to have a vivid description, a much more detailed description of what the status quo look like and what your proposed world would look like. Be very specific as to what elements change. Is it an attitude that changes? Is it a perception that changes? Is it a culture that changes? Is it a behavior that changes? Is it a socialization that changes? What changes? You need to be very, very specific about the things that change in the world that you are comparing, and that sort of gives more guarantee about your outcome happening. Okay. And that's very important. If you want to sort of exploit it for opponents, then people, and here's how people a lot of the time argue. People think in their heads and they forget that they are just them and everyone else is not in their head. So they rationalize things to a point and their arguments make sense from there. The problem people make is that they don't tell the audience, the judges, and other speakers what initial rationalization they did in their head before continuing with their arguments for it to make sense, which means that they don't do their setup. The setup is in their head, but they don't communicate it to everyone else. So you can always question the extent to which people rely on undefined or unrealistic or unclear characterizations of a world. And then you can explore why certain things are not likely to occur in that world. So the short example that is there in a debate about banning social media, being able to define specifically what a ban entails is very, very crucial. So, for example, my go-to approach of defining a ban is one, that we are going to propose the legislation, propose the ban. There will be widespread consultations with industry experts. There will be widespread consultations with academics and people who have opposed it and civil society organizations. There'll be widespread consultations with the public, especially in policy motions when you have a lot of fiat. And then there will be long, prolonged debates and refinements and retweaking of the laws and its words. And then there will probably be a notice period of the ban so that companies can have the time to readjust, maybe meet new expectations. So the citizens can also move their communications, businesses can adjust, whatever. And then the ban will take effect maybe after 1 year or after 6 months of announcement. That is my world. I would be very detailed about it, but a lot of people won't, right? Because everybody assumes that a ban is a ban and everybody knows what a ban is. But no, not everyone knows what a ban is. At least, not everyone knows the ban with the specific mechanisms that are required for your argument to make sense. And so you need to build up that world and set it up in a way that makes sure that you have the premises you need for your arguments to make sense, right? So that's how you explore a setup building and try and do it very well. And if you think that within a debate, your setup is probably the most important thing, which I think it is for a lot of policy debates, then I tend to spend a lot more time on my setup because once I can specifically explain the exact mechanisms or the exact approaches within which that policy is set up, then I can debate from there on, knowing very well that anytime opposition says, well, but a lot of businesses do their work on social media and you're going to disrupt communication, my response is, but yeah, that's why I said I'll give them 6 months to change their communication tools. So there's enough time for businesses to adjust, right? And that gives you some form of buffer to deal with potential pushbacks that comes from the opposition side. So that's mainly a setup burden. And again, I hope that makes sense. The next type is the burden on incentives, right? Let's see why. Okay, the burden on incentives. Now, I think we've mostly found that that is the easiest one we come up with, to believe that people have the ability or the willingness to do something, right? So it's basically just proving that the individuals involved, whether it is a government, company, people, what do you call it, a civilization, a culture, religion, whatever, have a rational motivation to believe or behave in the way in which your argument claims they will. So in the parent example, they love their kids. They have a biological inclination to, there are all these things that compel them to do that. But like I was saying, there are two types of incentives. So I think it's very important to know because the second one I find more persuasive than the first one. The first one is a lot of the time what we do, which is explain that the institutions or the individuals themselves have an incentive, an inherent incentive to act in the way in which we want them to act. Right. So parents love their children, so they would want to do that. Parents care for their children, so they would want to do that. Governments want to retain power, so they would want to do that. But internal motivations sometimes tend to be weaker especially if other people can prove limitations, right? Which we'll get to. If people can prove limitations, then internal motivations become weaker. What makes it very, very persuasive, though, as an incentives, is to prove external motivations or external incentives. Why? Because those ones seems to be one independent of the actor involved, so they are not the one controlling how that incentive behaves. If the state has a legal requirement for parents to take good care of their children, then parents do not get to choose when they care or when they don't. They always have to care. Why? Because there is a big bully in the name of the state who would come and take your child if you do not behave well. Am I still audible? No. Let me see. Okay, awesome. So there's like the government who is the big bully who come and take your child, right? And that is a much more persuasive incentive because to the judge, that feels like then we are not just relying on your random arbitrary preferences. We are relying on somebody who has a specific authority and incentive, and they are applying pressure on you to behave well. So the external sources of incentives tend to be much more compelling. And the strategic advantage to that is that those external sources of incentives will then force the entity to move beyond their limitations. The state would come for your child, regardless of whether or not you have enough time. So you would find time. That is the difference between the state compelling you to care for your child and you having an innate drive to care for your child. Also, because there are conflicting incentives within that person, right? So, as much as they want to spend time with their child, they also need money. So, they want to do their job. They also need a promotion. So, they would want to spend more time at work. The state doesn't care about their job or their promotion. So, the state has a strict requirement. And so, they will compel you to sort of spend time with that kid or not expose the child to circumstances that amount to negligence or abuse, right? And that sounds more persuasive and more compelling. And the reason why I'm doing this is to say that anytime you are proving incentive burdens, think about both the internal and external incentives, right? So that you don't limit yourself into just internal incentives. But also, this is a good way to rebut incentives, even when people just rely on internal ones. Because so far as you can prove two things. One, that there are limitations to the expression of those internal incentives. And two, that there is, how do you call it? There are multiple internal incentives of that person that are likely to conflict. Then you are likely to dismantle the persuasiveness of that internal incentive that your opponents are relying on, right? So this is a good way to sort of utilize the incentive burden and explore it very, very well. Okay, now let's look at the capacity bit. Now, capacity is a burden that people ignore all the time, like I said, because we end up in situations where we think that incentive is enough. But think about our everyday lives. Like we all have big dreams. We all have incentives to do amazing things. We all have incentives to do one thing or the other, but we don't always have the capacity to do it. For instance, when I was young, before I went to uni, I loved music. I used to be part of my church choir and I used to sing a lot. But when I went to school and I started debating, I had to choose between debate and music, and I chose debate with the rationale that, okay, when I go back home, I will still join the choir on holidays and be able to, I don't know, sing a little bit before I come back to school. Only to realize my vacations were spent a lot more doing debate competitions than staying at home, which means that despite all my incentives to want to still engage with music and do it and love it and experience it, I just did not have the capacity to do that. That means I still do not get the benefits of engaging with music. So incentives alone and setup alone are not enough to guarantee an outcome, right? So essentially, you must prove that there are the practical means to explain or to achieve the outcome. And in this instance, it's like the resources, the skills, the the time, and their ability to perform the actions that are required. And a lot of the time, people miss that. So, in the context of parents, we should be able to prove parents actually have the money. Do most parents have the money to take care of children? Do most parents have the money to provide all the needs of children and not risk one thing or the other? Because there are lots of parents who sometimes have to delay taking their children to the hospital because they don't have their money yet, right? They have to wait for their paycheck at the end of the week or at the end of the month. They maybe have traveled on a work trip and are not just present, so they are not aware of the things that are happening. So they do not have the time, which is a limitation on capacity. Some parents maybe gave birth too early without taking any informative courses or any informative experience on parenting. Therefore, they simply do not have the skill set. And think about it, as much as we want to believe that parents have life experiences, none of the life experiences of parents are about bringing up children. Therefore, a lot of parents actually, when they give birth to their very first child, that first child is subjected to a lot of experimentation. In fact, all children are subjected to it because bringing up your first child is wildly different because there are two different sets of children with two different characteristics and all that. So you can actually make a perpetual argument that parents do not have the capacity in most instances to bring up their children. And if you can do that, that significantly undermines the whole arguments on setup and capacity, right? And incentives. And you might ask, okay, then how do you prove that capacity happens? Because it seems very easy to rebut capacity, right? You can rely on the incentive will be gained. So if parents really have the incentive to care for their children most, then it means that when they go to the hospital, they are probably also likely to ask, what are the kinds of foods I should give to my child for them to be healthy? So they are likely to take the steps to acquire the capacity if they have the incentives. And then you can use that to extend into the likelihood of acquiring capacity, and then you can use that to guarantee your impact, right? So that's how you try and do it on a positive end to limit to utilize incentives as a motivation or a capacity. Maybe parents who care are more likely to read on their child, they are more likely to take steps, etc. Right? Yeah. Srijoni, I hope I didn't butcher your name. Any questions?
Yeah,
Hi,
you
I
talk
see a
about
hand up.
how.
Any questions?
Yeah, am I audible? Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible. Go ahead.
Cool. You talk about how the setup burden is particularly important in policy motions. So, for the other burdens in incentive and capacity, is there also a particular set of motions where it is particularly important?
So that's a good question. The other types of burdens are probably important in all types of motions. The reason why I singled out setup for policies because that's when you have a fiat to dictate a set of circumstances under which you take an action, right? And so you have the room to make more up when it comes to the setup that you want to use. But when it comes to incentive, capacity, they come with all types of arguments that you want to prove in all types of motions. And the main thing then you need to do is the setup I spoke about, which means to understand that your argument to be believable. Therefore, you need to spend more time proving it. And so, for instance, in the case of parents, I am sure it's more believable that they have the incentive to care for their children, but it's less believable that all parents have the capacity. So you might spend a bit more time on proving why they have capacity. Which means that you don't have to prove all burdens in an argument. You just have to find which one needs the most proof and spend more time on it. For the others, you can just use one liners. The ones that you know that people believe it already. You can just use one liners. The ones that you know that people believe it already. You can just use one liners one-liners to highlight them, and it's still believable as mechanisms. But then for the ones that are least or less believable, you spend more time on proving them. Okay, so let's look at the next type, which is process or mechanism, right? Now, we are all used to mechanisms, which is essentially proving that something happens. Usually, it's very, very easy to not do it, which is, I think, that should be the easiest thing that debaters end up doing, because everything we want to do is logical. Everything we want to achieve is with some form of action, processes, and then reaction, which is an outcome, right? But you need to describe the step-by-step process by which things take place, right? And you need to be able to explain how your action that you are taking. Some people tend to say that your mechanisms are essentially a combination of all the other types of burdens. Like your mechanisms are like your incentive, your capacity, your limitation burdens become your mechanism. I don't think that's the case, because sometimes judges just require a quick step-by-step recap of exactly how things play out, right? And so you can I remember in the grand final of the motion I did last week, I wanted to prove that because the motion was about a town or a village making one decision over the other, right? I think it was a town making one decision over the other. And I wanted to prove that before they make that decision that I wanted them to make in the debate, they would have taken a series of steps, right? But to make that very visible, I just had to paint a picture in the minds of the judges and say, just imagine the entire debate. Before political leaders can persuade people to pick the option on my side, they have to be able to explain to them that we are going to prepare you, we are going to buy the equipment and all the things that you need to make sure that this particular decision that you take is not one that is going to kill you or end your family or whatever, right? So by just describing that quick mechanism process to say that, well, just picture it, I have to sort of meet their concerns, and those concerns would likely be about, would this decision hurt me? Would I be prepared for it? And just by quickly stating that process, I'm able to get much more buy-in to the very decision that I want to make, and create a mechanism that leads to much more likely outcomes on my end, right? So if you look at the short example on the slide, for instance, you need to indicate the specific process. When I was debating in that motion where the parent thing came about, one of the big questions that came up was, okay, assuming parents have the incentive, they have the capacity, how do we know that parents would know exactly when to exercise that capacity in order to achieve the outcomes? Because parents have authority over their kids, right? Parents have money to take care of their kids. How do we know that parents would know exactly when to exercise that capacity in order to achieve the outcomes, right? So you know when to buy something for their child and when to deny them. So you sort of want to walk them through the process by which that capacity is basically exhibited in order to achieve that outcome, right? So if you look at the short example on the slide, for instance, is trying to detail the exact steps of a ban, right? If legalization is passed, then we notify companies, then maybe that app is removed and enforcement actions take some time. But in certain debates, it probably becomes a very good overview of giving judges a clear logical approach to how things exist within the outcome. And then you look at the next one, which is limitation, call it possibility and limitations. I'm going to explain these things as one set. So let's just do limitations, because now limitations is understanding that people do not exist in an isolated world. They exist within a world that has other forces acting in opposition to their own active interests or active incentives or active intent and actions and all that. So you'd want to be able to explain that. Come. Yes, Srijoni, your hands are up.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you. Your voice is breaking a bit.
Oh, is it better now?
Not really.
Hi, is it better now? Okay, give me a second. Wait, I'm not sure why. That's weird because my Wi-Fi seems okay on my end. Is it saying it's breaking or shaky? Let me see. Ooh. Okay. Um, am I audible now?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry about that. I just had to change the microphone option on my call. Cool. So let's look at limitations, right? And I think after this, we just have the practical example that we'd use. So in terms of limitations, uh, hi everyone. Sorry, I had to change my Wi-Fi because I noticed my Wi-Fi was messing up. I've connected to my phone's hotspot, and hopefully that's more stable than the Wi-Fi itself. I don't know whether the weather is bad outside or what, but cool. Um, limitations, like I was saying, is essentially noticing that people sometimes also have conflicting things that take away their capacity or take away their interest. And those are essentially the limitations that you're talking about, right? So you need to figure out how to deal with those. For instance, a parent really want to take care of their child, but they're limited by time, they're limited by money, they're limited by, so anything, basically anything that undermines any of the previous burdens are limitations. And so as you debate and try to prove things, you have to be aware of the limitations that you have. It's very, very important that as a speaker, you are aware of the limitations that you have, because then you're able to do things like preemptive rebuttals and all that. Okay. But it also helps you undermine other opponents if they are not acknowledging their own limitations. So For instance, if you are trying to ban a specific internet service, you should obviously know that there's a limitation to its effectiveness, that people can use VPNs to bypass it. But then when you acknowledge it, then you're able to say, well, maybe it's just a small section of people. Or even if they use VPNs to bypass it, it's still a cost intensive measure of accessing it. Like you have to pay for VPN subscriptions and free VPNs and all that grades and all that. And so you sort of admit it and basically explain why. And it has a psychological effect on judges, right? If you're a debater and you admit your own limitation and explain it away before an opponent comes to mention it, it loses a certain effect that it would have had on the judge, right? Because if they said it before you come to respond to it, it sounds like you are just reacting and you're not that good of a speaker who didn't preempt or didn't think about your own limitation. But if you said it and responded to it before they come and repeat it, it does two things. One, it's no more new to the judge, so it's not that effective, right? And two, it means that they now have to do a lot more work to rebut it beyond the explanation that you gave for that limitation, right? And if you, I'm sure we've all watched some form of legal series or something before, but you'd see a lot of lawyers who are defending a client say that we waive the reading of charges and we plead either guilty or not guilty, right? And it's the same logic that anytime you allow an opponent to say something without you saying it first, it has a little bit more power and persuasive sway because it's new and you are the first and they are the first people to bring it up. But if you admit it or you prevent them from having to say it, it loses its power that it would have had on the judges. So there's a little bit of psychology going on there in terms of limitations. But then if you explain away the limitations, then you are doing the previous one, which is possibility. You're basically explaining that despite the limitations, it's possible, and therefore the outcome is going to happen. Okay. All right. And then the final one is your outcomes. Now, this one, everybody knows how to do it. It's super easy. Explaining that your outcomes, the specific example of the outcomes that occur, the impact, what specific benefits you get from it, and all that. These are the ones we know how to do from day one when it comes to debate. So it's not that difficult. But yeah, essentially, these are the burdens that you have broadly when it comes to debate. I think all forms of burdens I can categorize and put into these 7 broad categories. But like I said, knowing which one to focus more on is probably the most important skill. And so a drill that I used to do in 2020 when I started teaching this with the group that I was in was I give them a motion. I ask them to put an argument up, prioritize the most important argument they want to prove, and ask them to list all the burdens they think that they need to prove to win the argument, and then ask them to figure out which of these is the most controversial, which of the burdens is the most difficult for a judge to believe, or which of them is an opponent likely to disagree with. And then you have to spend more time coming up with ways of proving that burden. And they did it over and over and over and over again. And you can try and do it for yourself. And again, I did it and it helps me a lot with being able to right from the start know what will be the point of contention or what will be the point of disagreement in a debate or about an argument. Okay. All right. So here's the case study that we're going to use. And I hope everyone will take part in this because it'll be very helpful. The motion I gave to my students yesterday had an info slide. The info slide was, in a remote valley, the village of Ibu relies on a single enchanted lake for all their water. Legend says the lake will vanish unless once every generation into the depths of the river. Okay. The ritual has kept the lake full for centuries, but it has also wiped away valuable knowledge, history, science, and forcing each generation to start anew. This house, as the people of Ibu, would continue the ritual and sacrifice their recorded knowledge. This was the motion. Okay. I hope this motion makes sense. I'll give everyone about a minute to read through it, make sense of it. You can take a screenshot if you want to reference it as we go through the exercise. But I mean, the image here provides a very good depiction of it. There's some form of conception. This is the river, this is the village. That's the only place they get water. And the legend has this that the only way that the water stays is if they dump all their recorded knowledge, whether written and recorded, into the depths of the river. And every generation has to do it, right? Okay. If we are good to proceed, give me a thumbs up. If we are good to proceed, give me a thumbs up, and then we can proceed with the specific discussions that we have to have a practical explanation of this. Awesome. I've gotten 2 thumbs ups. I hope, oh, more thumbs ups now. Thank you very much. So let's look at this. Um, in this motion, proposition wants to make an argument, right? They want to make an argument that they won't lose much valuable knowledge, right? Because the most essential information can be preserved still because people will simply memorize it before the ritual. So their claim to try and mitigate the damage that comes with losing knowledge is that, well, people would, I don't know, memorize as much of the information as possible and just carry it on to the next generation and pass it on to the next generation. So, what do you think are the burdens they need to prove here to make this argument persuasive? And after we identify the burdens, we can figure out which one is the most important burden to prove. So let's type out the burdens that we think they need to prove. You can type it in the chat. Of all the burdens that we've discussed, what do you think are the burdens that they need to prove to make this argument persuasive? Okay, process capacity limitation. Cool. Yeah, that's a good set. Anyone that we think Prachi has missed? Is there any burdens that we think has been missed in that list? Process capacity limitation, that's a good set. Do we need to prove incentive to do this? Do we need to prove incentive to do this? The incentive to carry out and memorize information and pass it down? Or the incentive is assumed? You can let me know. Maybe the incentive is very easy and easy to be persuaded. Okay, the incentive is assumed, so that's good. All right, so we need process, capacity, and limitation. Great. Now, which of these do you think is the most important to prove? Or which of these do you think will be the most difficult to prove? Process, capacity, and limitation. Capacity. Great. Why? Why would capacity be the most difficult to prove? Why would capacity be the most difficult to prove? It's not intuitive, right? It's not intuitive, but I also think that human memory is volatile. That's the thing. We all believe that our memory is not that accurate. And it's not that great at storing large volumes and bringing everything out, right? So it's not intuitive that people can actually preserve so much in their brains and put it out there. And so that's a burden that we need to prove. But you see, when my students did the debate yesterday, they didn't prove that because obviously they were not focusing on what specific sets of burdens you need to prove to make this argument true. And once you start viewing arguments from a burden point of view, it always gives you enough analysis or enough things to cover in your speech. That's why sometimes people would ask, how is a very advanced speaker able to cover just one extension or two extensions and use 7 minutes and they are so persuasive? It's because they're just good at knowing the burdens they need to prove. Burdens that a lot of people don't even realize they need to prove, and they pick it up and explain it very, very well. So yes, if we are proving this argument, I'm sure we would all do the things that we are talking about. And here, they missed the capacity burden, like we all said. So for instance, what they failed to prove is how much information a generation can realistically memorize. They failed to prove how accuracy is preserved over the decades and preserve the memory to begin with, right? And why this matters, like we said, is because if the capacity for memorization is not proven, the claim of the knowledge retention collapses, and the benefit is purely just very, very volatile. So if you think about it, the corrected version could be they can prove capacity by showing that there would be likely be a deliberate culture built around memory. Like there will probably be institutions like knowledge keepers for training and people keeping the knowledge and people who are just trained to memorize as much as possible, right? And maybe a process where the villagers assign specific pieces of memory of information to people to memorize and then rewrite afterwards, right? Those specific things could significantly elevate the strength and the persuasiveness of the argument. But if you miss it, then that argument is gone, right? So this is a very, very good example. And let's look at another example. There are four arguments that they made, which I want us to explore the burdens, right? So this is a good one. Well done to everyone. I think we all got the capacity right. So let's see. The next argument that Prop made is their side is better because they can prepare for the ritual, right? Because they are saying every generation they have to do the ritual. They are saying they can prepare for the ritual. So by carefully planning before they dump the written knowledge, they can significantly reduce the losses. What kind of burden do you think they are missing here in order to make this argument persuasive? What kind of burden do you think they are missing here? I can think of two. You can think of any others. What kind of burdens do you think they're missing here? Any ideas? You can put it in the chat. Any ideas of the types of burdens we think they are missing? No ideas? So I can think of maybe, okay, setup is one. So setup is good. Um, Setup is very good. I can also think of process. Sort of, it's quite unclear how you are going to do that. Yes. So process is true. You guys are correct. Process, because it's quite unclear how they're going to do it, right? So setup and process are probably the most important ones. And if you have a team that had already proven the capacity in the previous argument, then probably that capacity also transfers to this one. So you are able to just mainly focus on the setup and the process for this argument. So let's look at ways in which we can try and prove that, right? Um, you essentially they are failing the process or the mechanism burden, like we said, right? And the corrected version would be sometimes explaining something like in the last 10 years of every generation, there'll be mass teaching sessions that are held, right? Each villager will be assigned a specific set of facts to memorize. And immediately after the ritual, where they dump all the information, they all collaboratively start writing down every information that they've memorized. And immediately after the ritual, That way, they preserve as much of what they dumped on the new timeline, right? So here, 10 years prior to the mass, 10 years prior to the ritual day, there's mass team. Right after the ritual day, the post ritual, they all start writing down what they have memorized, right? And that's a process of explaining how a little bit unpersuasive types of burden you are explain because look at the time, but somehow it. But opposition also argued that they could find new water, right? Even if they decided not to dump their knowledge anymore, they could find new water. And they sort of pointed to the idea that exploration would be possible, but they didn't define, for instance, the geography or the technology within which this exploration will be possible. So let's focus on opposition, because I think for proposition, we dealt with the capacity setup. What kind of burdens is opposition missing here to prove that there would likely be an exploration for new forms of water? So that's a good question. Can you question the ritual as up? I'm going to do something. I'm going to take you back to the motion and ask yourself whether you can question the ritual as up. And let's figure out what things makes you do that. Here's the info slide. Who thinks we can question the ritual as up? And why? What in the info slide helps us question the ritual? Yes, Prachi. Yes. Yes. Awesome. Thank you very much. Well done, Srijoni.
At the same time, opposition can say, right, that it is very unbelievable to think that this lake has gone on providing to this particular village for centuries, never failed. So the villagers will
Yeah,
likely not want to take the risk, even if it is not logically explainable.
yeah, yeah. And so it's true, like Prachi said, in the info slide, it says legend says. Legend is not a fact. Legend is like there's some form of myth that says that, and we all have like myths that we've heard in our neighborhoods and in our families and in our cultures. There's a myth of something that's told, and it's just practically not true, right? But there are myths around it all the time, and we sort of lend our beliefs to it for the time being, but it doesn't restrict us from the way in which we behave. So on opposition, you can sort of explain that people can legitimately question the validity of this myth and could go ahead on an exploration, right? And so if you look at it, for instance, where is it? Yeah. Here on up, you essentially just need to question the setup and recorrect the setup in the debate, right? To say that, for instance, you need to explain that, yeah, the geography is likely to allow for exploration if the legend is reliable and if whether or not the lake is truly the only water source, right? And the way in which I was explaining this to my students is yeah, the same way prop can say that they would prepare to go and memorize everything and transfer their knowledge and rewrite them. Op could also say, for the generation, we are dedicating our time and technology and resources to finding new water sources. And most likely, they would find one before the generation is up, which if you give and take maybe 100 years, they might find one and decide to say that, yeah, we will not dump our knowledge anymore, right? But the problem in the debate as of now is that because it's a myth, and because they've been dumping all their knowledge, there is no factual documentation of the fact that the lake is actually what the myth says it is. Therefore, there is room for challenging it. And you just need to create a good setup for how that challenge changes the way in which that village would approach that generation that decides to challenge it, right? And that's a way in which you can go about it. Okay, let's look at one final example. Opposition says, instead of destroying our knowledge, we should stop the ritual. We can survive by exploring to find new sources of water, digging wells or building systems to store rainwater. What burdens do we think they need to prove in order to make this alternative a reasonable one and persuasive one? What burdens do we think they need to prove? Okay, limitations. So yes, they need to prove limitations. Capacity and incentive. Yes. So you'd notice that over here, they need to prove that people would actually want to go against the myth. And like Prachi was saying, yeah, it's just a myth. There's no documentation. So there's some room for doubt that you'd explain to unearth the incentive that people want. And also people would definitely love the incentive of preserving their own information. So that could be a good incentive explanation. You need to prove the capacity. You need to explain the limitations that they're likely to face and explain how you can go about it, right? And those are very, very good examples. So again, a lot of this is around limitation and possibility. So you essentially need to prove the detailed methods, the tools, the timeline, the reasons why villagers would break the deeply held cultural beliefs, which is around incentive and the capacity and all that. So you'd see that a lot of it is then boiling down to taking away all the limitations around incentive, around capacity and process to be able to execute this. And for me, this is what makes debate exciting, right? Because when I think about an argument and I realize that, oh my God, I know what I need to prove to win this argument, it makes it very, very, very exciting. And it always gives you a detailed set of analysis to use to prove an argument, right? And it also improves your clarity because then there is less and less ambiguity and more clarity about how things happen within your debate. Okay, so I think we are just around time up, but that leaves me to, I think, my final two slides also. So again, we've mentioned clearly why missing burdens would kill your benefits, right? Burdens are essentially very, very important in proving that something would happen. And especially if you miss controversial ones or naturally unpersuasive ones, your argument is naturally weak, right? And your opponents are able to attack it easily. So these are the 7 burdens that we've mentioned. You can try and check them out. I would try and share the PowerPoint with Aditya so they can share it with the rest of you. But yeah, you can think about these and always try and consider how you apply them. And in terms of how to use them for rebuttals, it's a very entertaining process. Always find out what burdens they did not or they forgot. And especially if you find a strong burden that they needed to prove and they didn't prove it, a controversial one, that's it. They are done, right? And so always find burdens and explore burdens in your opponent's argument and then press it, pressure it, challenge it, and question those burdens. And if they are not able to prove it, then you win. So essentially, all this workshop says is that strong arguments meet burdens that are required, weak arguments miss them, and the greatest debaters have come to know which one is which and which ones to prove the most. So thanks so much for the time and for spending about an hour and 30 minutes of your time with me. I hope this workshop was helpful and all the best in your debates presentation. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Andrews. Thank you for the session. It was really great. We totally enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
All right, thanks. I hope, are there any questions from anyone? If not, then I will stop sharing my screen. Um, okay, I'm guessing there are no questions. Cool. So I'm just going to, oh, there was a question? Okay. Paddy, you have a question for me?
Yeah, so can proportion take the stance that they will keep memorizing that same knowledge or the same set of information for generations and keep dumping those records into that lake so that that lake remains for eternity and they keep that knowledge for eternity with themselves as well.
Yeah, they can. And I think there's a crucial way to even do it, which is even better. Remember, the info slide says only the knowledge is disposed into written and documented knowledge is disposed. So all forms of technology that they build is actually not thrown into the lake, right? Which means, let's say I've built a car, that's a new technology. The next generation is still able to use the car so far as I can keep the knowledge and pass it on as to how to use a car, right? So it makes it easier even in terms of the amount of knowledge that they have to pass on, maybe how to use a car, how to build a car. But yeah, proposition can argue that they will just create a system that constantly memorizes things and carries that memory into, like we've seen movies or something where it's like a bloodline thing. When you're born into a certain type of family, you have a specific special responsibility for the village. So there are families of warriors. So there could be families of members of the better part of it, I think, is that human beings are created in such a way that when we have to activate and rely on a specific set of our senses over and over again, it improves in its capacity. So, for instance, think about a blind person. When they are walking around, they hear far more things than we, the average people who can see, because they rely on their ears to know their surroundings, while we rely on our eyes. By doing a reliance on their ears, they develop their hearing senses to be much more efficient and much more complicated than we who don't, right? It's the same argument about ChatGPT and people using their brains less. So if you think less and you're relying on everyone doing something, then your brain development slows. So in such a village, if they are trained on memorizing a lot of things, there's a presumption that their capacity to memorize is also far more efficient than the average person that we think of now. And so they would be much more specialists at memorizing and retrieving memory. And that would make the process even more efficient, right? So I hope that answers your question and I hope that makes sense.
Makes sense. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you.